A black woman with a composed demeanor extended her hand across the polished conference table. Richard Sterling, the white CEO, glanced at the hand with undisguised contempt. "I don't shake hands with employees," he said, smirking at his colleagues. The room seemed to grow several degrees colder. She withdrew her hand, her composure unshaken. "I'm not an employee," she said softly. Richard laughed, turning to his all-male executive team. "Then what are you doing in my building?" She opened her leather briefcase, slowly, deliberately. "I'm deciding whether or not to withdraw my $2 billion investment." Her voice never rose above a conversational tone. The room froze. Richard's smirk vanished. The executives' faces paled as they looked at the woman standing before them. Victoria Hayes stepped out of a modest sedan in the Sterling Tech parking lot. At 45, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, an understated elegance. Her mission for the day: to assess whether Sterling Tech was worthy of a $2 billion investment from her venture capital fund. She observed the gleaming headquarters, a glass and steel monolith reaching for the sky, a monument to technological success. Yet, her research suggested a potentially toxic corporate culture lurked beneath the polished exterior. Inside, the receptionist, Sarah Miller, looked up with a customer service smile that quickly vanished when she saw Victoria. "I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Richard Sterling," Victoria said. Sarah's eyebrow rose slightly. "Are you the administrative candidate?" "Human Resources is on the 3rd floor. I have a direct appointment with Mr. Sterling." Victoria's voice remained even. "Victoria Hayes." Sarah checked her screen. Skepticism etched on her face. "Oh, please wait in that area." She gestured to an adjacent seating area, not the plush VIP lounge where 2 white men in suits were being served coffee. Victoria noted this, but sat without comment. She observed everything: the flow of employees, predominantly white and male, the hushed tones as people glanced her way, the unspoken biases simmering just beneath the surface. 45 minutes passed before Richard's assistant came for her. Not the plush executive boardroom, but a small, windowless conference room awaited. Richard Sterling barely looked up from his phone when she entered, waving vaguely toward a chair across the table. 3 other executives, all white men in similar gray suits, exchanged knowing glances. One tried to stifle a yawn. Internally, Victoria recognized the pattern. 20 years in finance had taught her to read these signals with precision. Every slight was familiar: the extended wait time, the downgraded meeting room, the disrespectful greeting. She decided to see just how far they would take their disrespect before she revealed her true identity. Richard finally put his phone down. He looked at Victoria for the first time, his eyes giving her a cursory appraisal. "So, you're here to talk about some diversity initiative?" His tone suggested this was an obligation to be endured rather than a meeting of equals. "I'm here to discuss potential investment opportunities," Victoria clarified calmly. Richard barely concealed his skepticism. "Right. Investment." The word hung with an air of disbelief. As Richard prepared his patronizing presentation, Victoria's phone vibrated with a text from her CFO, Ben Carter. "Confirmed. Ready to deploy or pull based on your assessment." "Let me walk you through what we do here at Sterling Tech," Richard began, pulling up a presentation clearly designed for a non-technical audience. The slides were filled with cartoonish graphics and oversimplified diagrams. "We are developing cutting-edge AI solutions for enterprise clients." He spoke at an exaggeratedly slow pace, pausing after every basic concept. "Are you keeping up?" he asked after explaining what an algorithm was. Behind him, an executive whispered something to another, prompting a stifled chuckle. Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Your prospectus mentions a proprietary deep learning architecture. Could you elaborate on how it differs from conventional models, particularly regarding inference latency when deployed at scale?" Richard blinked, momentarily thrown. He fumbled with the presentation remote. "Well, it's quite technical. Perhaps my CTO can walk you through the complex stuff later." His eyes darted to his colleagues for support. "I'm also curious about the discrepancy in your Q2 financial reports," Victoria continued. "Your reported R&D spending decreased by 22% while claiming an expansion of research initiatives. How do those numbers reconcile?" Richard's expression hardened. He clicked rapidly through the slides, skipping the financial details. "I think these complex financial matters might be a bit beyond the scope of our discussion today. Perhaps we should focus on more appropriate topics, like Sterling Tech's approach to diversity initiatives. His emphasis on the word appropriate hung in the air. In Richard's mind, alarm bells were ringing. This woman clearly knew more than he had anticipated. Instead of adjusting his approach, he doubled down on his condescension. His fragile authority threatened. "Let's take a quick break," Richard announced abruptly. Emily, Richard's assistant, was summoned to bring in coffee. He turned to Victoria with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How do you take your coffee? Lots of cream and sugar, I presume." The racist implication of his words blanketed the room. The executives exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others quietly amused. Victoria cataloged every micro-expression, every silent exchange. She slowly closed her briefcase, the soft click of the leather audible in the sudden silence. Her eyes met Richard's directly, unwavering. "Before we continue, I'd like to see your diversity and inclusion statistics for executive-level positions." Richard's jaw tightened as he realized this woman would not be as easily dismissed as he had planned. The meeting resumed in a larger conference room. Richard had summoned reinforcements, including Daniel Green, Sterling Tech's diversity officer, and tellingly, the only other person of color in the building at a management level. "Daniel is going to walk us through our diversity initiatives," Richard announced, his tone suggesting he was being exceptionally accommodating. Daniel stood, clearly rehearsed. "Sterling Tech is committed to fostering an inclusive environment. Our minority hiring rate has increased by 8% over the previous year." He clicked through slides showing carefully selected photos of smiling employees from various backgrounds. "What is the retention rate for those employees?" Victoria asked. Daniel fumbled. "I don't have those specific figures." "And what about promotional pathways? How many people of color have been advanced to senior leadership in the past 5 years?" "We have implemented mentorship programs that we believe will yield positive results in the future," Richard interrupted. "We're making progress." Rome wasn't built in a day. His dismissive wave cut off the discussion as the conference room door opened. 5 more executives entered. All were white men in their 52nd. Richard instantly brightened, standing to offer hearty handshakes and back pats. Jokes about their recent golf outing flowed freely. Victoria, simply Saturday. When Richard finally remembered her presence, his introduction was telling. "Gentlemen, this is Victoria." He paused, as if he couldn't remember her last name. "She's here today to discuss our diversity initiatives. Not Miss Hayes, not a potential investor, just Victoria." She was reduced to a first name and a presumed agenda. The executives gave perfunctory nods. 2 made no eye contact at all. One executive, Kevin Adams, according to his nameplate, leaned toward a colleague and whispered in an audible voice, "This diversity stuff. Just play along and she'll be gone by lunch." Victoria registered this with no visible reaction, though her pen made a small indentation in her notepad. "Perhaps you'd like to share your story with the group," Richard suggested to Victoria, his tone patronizing. "I'm sure everyone would be very interested in your journey." The implication was clear. Her value in this room was as a token, not as a business equal. When Victoria began discussing market trends, Richard cut her off. "That's not really what everyone is interested in," he said with a hollow laugh. "We have plenty of financial analysts for that. What we want to hear is your perspective as a—" He let the sentence hang, but his meaning was unmistakable. A well-dressed white man entered the room. Richard immediately stood, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Arthur, so glad you could join us." Victoria also stood and extended her hand in Arthur's direction. After a warm greeting to Arthur, Richard turned back to Victoria. His gaze passed over her, then settled on a point somewhere behind her, as if she didn't exist. He deliberately placed his hands behind his back and said flatly, "We don't shake hands with employees." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Some executives looked away, embarrassed but unwilling to intervene. Others offered a slight, complicit smirk. Victoria showed no shock or hurt, only a calm, appraising look. In her mind, this was not a new wound, but a confirmation. This was the exact evidence she came for, the pattern she had faced for 20 years, climbing the unforgiving ladder of high finance. Without breaking eye contact with Richard, Victoria reached for her phone and sent a one-word text to her waiting team. "Execute." "If you'll excuse me," Victoria said evenly, rising from her seat. "I need to use the restroom." Richard gave a dismissive wave, his attention already back on Arthur. The men immediately resumed their conversation as if Victoria had never been there. In the privacy of an empty stall, Victoria allowed herself 3 deep breaths, not of distress, but of focus. Her hand was steady as she dialed a number. "Ben," she said when her CFO answered. "Initiate phase 1. Both options are on standby." Ben confirmed the investment package or the withdrawal strategy. "The team is parked 2 blocks away. At your word, we'll start signaling concerns to key market analysts." "Begin the subtle market signals now," Victoria instructed. "Make it look organic, just enough to draw attention without revealing our hand. And the full dossier. Have it ready. I've documented everything. They've given us exactly what we came for." She ended the call, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back had endured rooms like this her entire career. Rooms where her competence was questioned, her presence resented, her value diminished. But today was different. Today, she held the power they hadn't yet bothered to recognize. Meanwhile, in the conference room, Richard chuckled with his team. "Another diversity checkbox ticked," he said, loosening his tie. "Corporate relations will be happy we took the meeting. Now, about that Peterson acquisition." His assistant hurried in, tablet in hand, a worried look on her face. "Sir, you should see this." Richard frowned at the interruption. "What is it, Emily?" She showed him the screen. Sterling Tech stock had taken an unexpected 1.2% dip in the last 15 minutes. No negative news had been released. No obvious explanation. Probably just normal volatility. Richard dismissed, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. Nothing to worry about. When Victoria returned, the atmosphere in the room had subtly changed. Several executives were checking their phones. A computer screen displayed a stock ticker. "Is something wrong?" Victoria asked innocently. "Nothing of consequence," Richard replied curtly. "Just some market fluctuation." "Listen, you." He paused, realizing he'd never properly acknowledged her last name. "I think we've covered everything for today. I'm sure you understand we have real business to attend to." "Of course," Victoria agreed pleasantly. "I just need one final meeting with you alone, Mr. Sterling. Then I'll be on my way." Annoyed but eager to be done with her visit, Richard agreed, leading her to his office while instructing his team to look into the stock fluctuation. Once the door was closed, Victoria's attitude shifted subtly, still calm, but with an unmistakable firmness. "I'd like to review my experience at Sterling Tech today," she began, her tone placid. "I was made to wait for 45 minutes, directed to a side area instead of your VIP lounge, presented with childish explanations of basic concepts, repeatedly asked if I was keeping up, interrupted while discussing financials, addressed only by my first name, told my perspective was of no value, and finally, explicitly denied a handshake with the declaration that you don't shake hands with employees." Richard started to interrupt, but Victoria continued methodically, her voice never rising. "I have legally recorded our entire interaction, as Georgia is a one-party consent state." Richard's face darkened as his phone buzzed with an incoming call flagged as an urgent major shareholder. Richard's phone buzzed again, and then again. He glanced between his phone and Victoria, conflict written on his face. "I need to take this," he said finally, no longer bothering with false politeness. While Richard spoke in hushed, urgent tones, Victoria observed his office. The prominently displayed trophies of success, the photos with celebrities and politicians, the distinct absence of any women or people of color in leadership roles captured in the corporate photos. "What do you mean, a 3% drop?" Richard hissed into the phone. "There's no news, no announcement, nothing." He listened, his face growing more strained. "Hayes Capital Group. Never heard of them. Why would they?" He fell silent, listening. His eyes flickered to Victoria, then back to his desk. He typed furiously into his computer keyboard, his face draining of color as he read something on the screen. Victoria could track his discovery in real time. The frantic search for Victoria Hayes. The dawning horror as the results populated his screen. The founder and CEO of Hayes Capital Group, one of the most powerful Black-owned investment funds in the country. Over $50 billion in assets under management, with a reputation for divesting from companies with toxic cultures. Richard ended the call abruptly and stood. His entire demeanor changed. The arrogance vanished, replaced by naked panic. He hurried around the desk toward Victoria. "Miss Hayes," he began, his voice suddenly obsequious. "I believe there has been a terrible misunderstanding." "If I had known who you were." "There was no misunderstanding," Victoria interrupted, rising to meet his level. "You made it perfectly clear who you thought I was, and how you treat someone like that." She moved toward the door. Richard blocked her path. "Please, let's discuss this in private," he pleaded, desperation evident. "I'm sure we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement." The commotion was drawing attention. Employees in the hallway paused, watching. Several discreetly raised their phones, recording. Security guards, who had barely acknowledged Victoria's arrival hours earlier, now stood at attention, unsure if they should intervene as their CEO grew more agitated. "The time for that conversation was when you thought I was a nobody," Victoria said, her composure unshaken despite Richard's looming presence. He reached out as if to touch her arm, but stopped, aware of the witnesses. "You can't. I can," Victoria said simply. "And I am." She moved past him gracefully, the motion of someone who had navigated obstacles her entire career. As Victoria walked toward the exit, Sterling Tech's stock price flashed red on the lobby monitors, the drop accelerating to 7%. Whispers spread through Sterling Tech headquarters like an electric current. Employees gathered around computer screens, frantically searching for Victoria Hayes and Hayes Capital Group. Articles populated screens throughout the building. The history of Hayes Capital's ethical divestments. How Victoria Hayes built a $50 billion empire by demanding corporate accountability. The companies that had lost billions after Hayes Capital pulled its support. In the executive boardroom, Richard paced frantically. How did nobody know who she was? How did this happen? The meeting was just listed as V. Hayes, potential investor, his assistant explained, her voice trembling. "There was no detailed brief because you said it was just a diversity obligation meeting. We need damage control now," Richard snapped. Richard Sterling, his face ashen and his eyes wide with panic, could not believe what was happening. Sterling Tech, the brainchild he had painstakingly built, was in a freefall. He had always believed that money and power could conceal any flaw, any act of disrespect. But now, a woman he had dismissed just hours earlier had dealt a fatal blow to his empire. In the executive boardroom, the air was thick with tension. The executives, who had been laughing and whispering derogatory remarks moments ago, were now glued to their screens, where Sterling Tech's stock price continued its relentless plummet. Phones rang incessantly, each call bringing more bad news. Major investors, with whom Richard had once boasted of having good relationships, were now calling in droves, demanding explanations, threatening to pull their capital. The panic was beginning to spread. "What is happening?" Thomas, one of Richard's close executives, stammered, his voice trembling. "There's been no bad press, no major event." Emily White, Richard's assistant, tried to remain calm, but her hands trembled as she handed Richard another tablet. "Sir, market analysts are starting to release negative sentiment about our corporate culture. They're saying there are signs of a lack of transparency and discrimination." Richard snatched the tablet, his eyes scanning the headlines. Sterling Tech, a culture problem or market jitters. Investors question the work environment at Sterling Tech. Is Sterling Tech hiding something? These articles, while not yet mentioning Victoria Hayes or Hayes Capital Group directly, were sowing seeds of doubt in the minds of investors. A chill ran down Richard's spine. He knew exactly who was behind all of this: Victoria Hayes. The woman he had belittled, whose handshake he had refused, whom he had called an employee. He had underestimated her spectacularly. He had thought she was just another black woman trying to leverage the diversity and inclusion movement for personal gain. But she wasn't. She was a force, a woman of real power, and she had used that power to teach him a painful lesson. Richard roared, slamming his hand on the table. "Get her on the phone now." The executives scrambled, each rushing off to try and put out the raging fire. Daniel Green, the diversity officer, stood there, a look of devastation on his face. He had tried to warn Richard about the importance of building a fair and inclusive work environment, but Richard had dismissed him. Now, the consequences were clear. Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes had left the Sterling Tech building. She walked with a striking serenity, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. Her car glided smoothly through the New York streets, merging into the bustling traffic. Ben Carter, her CFO, was waiting in the car. "Everything is proceeding as planned, Victoria," Ben said. his voice full of admiration. "The market is reacting strongly. Analysts are starting to ask questions. And I have the full dossier ready for release." Victoria nodded. "Good. Ensure all information is released professionally and objectively. We don't want to be seen as launching a personal attack. We just want to clarify the truth and protect our principles." Victoria looked out the window, watching the city's skyscrapers. She had been through so much to get where she was today. She had faced discrimination, condescension, and deep-seated prejudice. But she never gave up. She always believed that fairness and respect were core values that every business should pursue, and she was ready to use her power to ensure those values were enforced. "Ben, prepare a press conference," Victoria said. "We will announce the reasons for our divestment, and we will emphasize the importance of diversity and inclusion in the corporate environment. This is not just an ethical issue, but a business issue. Companies cannot thrive sustainably if they do not respect all of their employees and partners." Ben nodded. "I'll handle everything. Do you want me to contact Richard Sterling? He's bound to try and negotiate." Victoria smiled. "No need. He'll find us. And when he does, make sure he understands the full consequences of his actions. We are not just divesting, we are sending a message." In the hours that followed, the media storm erupted. Hayes Capital Group, under the direction of Victoria Hayes, released a detailed report on the reasons for withdrawing its $2 billion investment from Sterling Tech. The report not only detailed issues with corporate culture and disrespect towards minority groups, but also pointed out the discrepancies in Sterling Tech's Q2 financial reports. The evidence Victoria had gathered during the meeting, including the legal audio recording, was released transparently. The stock market reacted violently. Sterling Tech's stock price continued to plummet, losing over 15% of its value in just a few hours. Panicked investors sold off their shares, fearing that Sterling Tech was facing a severe crisis. Major media outlets, from the Wall Street Journal to Bloomberg, all covered the story. Victoria Hayes and Hayes Capital Group became the center of attention, praised as pioneers in promoting corporate accountability. Richard Sterling and his team were trapped in a nightmare. He had tried to contact Victoria Hayes, but she did not respond. He had tried to quell the media storm, but every effort was futile. Every explanation he offered was seen as an excuse, every promise as a lie. His credibility, and that of Sterling Tech, was being severely damaged. In his office, Richard stared at the computer screen, where blinking red numbers scrolled continuously. He felt a deep sense of anger and regret. He had been too arrogant, too complacent. He had thought he could treat anyone however he wanted, as long as he had money and power. But Victoria Hayes had shown him that he was wrong. Money and power cannot buy respect, and disrespect can come at a very high price. "Sir, what do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice full of anxiety. "The investors are demanding an emergency meeting. The board of directors is also applying pressure." Richard closed his eyes, trying to think. He knew he could not continue to ignore Victoria Hayes. He needed to face her, and he needed to do it with humility. He had already lost too much, and he couldn't afford to lose any more. "Contact Miss Hayes," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "Tell her I want to see her. I want to apologize, and I want to find a solution." Emily nodded, hurrying away. Richard sat there alone, staring at the family photo on his desk. He remembered the words his father had once said, "Son, money can buy many things, but it can't buy character. Always treat people with respect, no matter who they are." Richard had forgotten those words, and now he was paying the price for forgetting. The meeting between Richard Sterling and Victoria Hayes took place a few days later, not at the magnificent headquarters of Sterling Tech, but at a neutral law office in downtown Manhattan. There was no fanfare, no entourage of assistants or executives, just Richard, Victoria, and their respective lawyers. Richard entered the room with a tense expression, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. He had lost so much in the past few days, not just financially, but in terms of credibility. He had been heavily criticized in the media, abandoned by investors, and doubted by partners. He knew he was in a position of weakness, and he needed to do everything he could to right his wrongs. Victoria Hayes sat there, as calm and confident as ever. She showed no sign of gloating or triumph. She was simply a woman doing her job, protecting her principles, and demanding fairness. "Miss Hayes," Richard began, his voice full of remorse. I want to sincerely apologize for how I treated you during our last meeting. I was wrong. I was disrespectful. And I underestimated you. He paused, looking directly into Victoria's eyes. I was too arrogant, too complacent. I let success blind me, and I lost sight of the basic values of respect and fairness. I am truly sorry. Victoria listened in silence, without interrupting. When Richard finished, she spoke, her voice still calm, but carrying great weight. Your apology is noted, Mr. Sterling. But an apology cannot erase what happened, nor can it restore the market's lost confidence. I know, Richard said, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to fix my mistakes. I'm prepared to make the necessary changes at Sterling Tech. I'm prepared to invest in genuine diversity and inclusion programs. I'm prepared to change our corporate culture. I just need a chance. Victoria looked at Richard for a long moment. She could see the desperation in his eyes, but she could also see a flicker of hope. She knew that Richard wasn't an entirely bad person. He was just a man who had been blinded by power and success, and she believed he could change. Mr. Sterling, Victoria said, I am not interested in destroying your company. I am interested in creating positive change. I am interested in ensuring that no one else has to go through what I went through. And I am interested in building a more just and inclusive business world. So what do you want? Richard asked, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. What do you want me to do? Victoria smiled. I want you to prove that you are serious about your apology. I want you to make real changes, not just empty promises. And I want you to become an example for others. Victoria presented a list of demands. They included Richard's resignation as CEO of Sterling Tech to move into an advisory role, a new board of directors with greater gender and racial diversity, a significant investment in diversity and inclusion programs, and a public commitment to changing the corporate culture. She also demanded that Richard publicly apologize to all Sterling Tech employees for his behavior. Richard listened carefully. He knew these demands were immense, and they would completely change his life and his company. But he also knew he had no other choice. He had lost too much, and he had to do everything he could to regain what was lost. I agree, Richard said, his voice full of resolve. I will do everything you ask. I will change, and I will ensure that Sterling Tech becomes a company everyone can be proud of. Victoria nodded. Good. I believe you can do it. And I also believe that, with this change, Hayes Capital Group can reconsider its decision to divest. Together, we can build a better future. In the following months, Richard Sterling made good on his promise. He resigned as CEO of Sterling Tech, making way for an experienced black female executive who quickly set about reforming the company. The board of directors was restructured to include more women and people of color. Diversity and inclusion programs were implemented in earnest, not just as empty slogans. Richard also publicly apologized to all Sterling Tech employees, admitting his mistakes and committing to change. His actions sent a wave of surprise and admiration through the business community. Many praised his courage and humility, and saw him as an example of how a person can change and learn from their mistakes. Hayes Capital Group, after witnessing the positive changes at Sterling Tech, decided to reinvest in the company. Their return helped Sterling Tech regain the market's confidence and restore its stock price. Sterling Tech, once a company criticized for its toxic culture, became a model of diversity and inclusion. Victoria Hayes continued her work at Hayes Capital Group, using her power and influence to promote fairness and accountability in the business world. She became a symbol of change, a woman who proved that true power lies not in money or status, but in integrity, courage, and the ability to stand up for what one believes in. The story of Victoria Hayes and Richard Sterling became a valuable lesson for everyone. It reminds us that respect is a two-way street, and that everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from, deserves to be treated with kindness and fairness. It also shows that even the most powerful people can make mistakes, and that what is important is to learn from those mistakes and strive to become a better version of oneself.